What's up, y'all? This just came to me, and I was like, oh, I need to talk about this. Because I heard it mentioned briefly in somebody else's live, and I heard Erica's live, but I really wanted to unpack it, which is that after that experience of incredible trauma, those people went back to work until 3 o'clock in the morning. And what I want you to know is that is white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy at work. To live in a society that subjects you to terrorism. And, I recognize, I just want to pause and say that I do hear a lot of the conversations right now around terrorism and the use of the term and the ways in which it has been propagated historically to really do harm to Arab and Muslim communities and to, as a tool of imperialism. And I really want to acknowledge that. I still think terrorism is real. I don't think it is not a real thing. I think the U.S. just tries to act like it's not its thing. And the reality is that the U.S. is built on terrorism. The U.S. was featuring terrorism long before, 9/11 happened or ISIL or any of the other projects that the U.S. has tried to call terrorism, right? The U.S. is founded on terrorism, which is, by definition, the use of violence for political control, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that I know that is a conversation that is happening, and that, my opinion on it might be a bit different, but I still want to acknowledge that. But I want to acknowledge also that the U.S. is particularly wedded to a certain kind of terroristic behavior, a certain kind of violent, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, indoctrination. So when we talk about, when we use this term of brainwashing, which people have been using a lot to describe Donald Trump and his impact and effect on the insurrectionists, right? On the white supremacist insurrectionists. What I think is important never to forget is that the willingness of the U.S. Congress to go back into that place that had just had an armed stand down and continue to engage. Because remember, those people had to go back in there, and when they went in there, had to be faced with Republican Congress people opposing the results of the election still. Continue to do the fuck shit that contributed to the horrifying experience they had encountered just hours earlier. But they sent all those people back in there to engage in more terror, to engage in more violence. And we call that nobility. We call that noble. We call that courageous. I call that violent white supremacist delusion indoctrination. I call that I want to think of all the therapeutic terms to describe when we call it codependency. We call it all kinds of things that describe what it means to neglect one's own care for the purpose of taking care of someone else who is in their own delusions, right? Who's steeped in their own, acting out and behavioral issues, likely as a result of their own trauma, right? We talk about it inside of addiction when, when the focus becomes so much about changing the addict's behavior that we stop actually thinking about our own behavior, our own impact. We neglect anything that's happening for ourselves for the purpose of navigating the addict's behavior. The U.S. is addicted to white supremacist delusion. And all of us are inside of a codependent relationship with the systems of this country. All of us are inside of an abusive relationship where we just want to go back and smooth over the violence that just happened, right? By returning to some semblance of normalcy without ever having actually dealt with the trauma that we experienced, or the causes of the violence in the first place. That is what we witnessed. And so when these people tell you that it was brave, that they were there for their democracy and all this other bullshit, please understand it as bullshit. Please understand it as a constant reaffirming of white supremacist delusion and indoctrination on a governmental and media level. They showed you that so that you could think that shit is normal. It is not normal to have people pointing guns at you, to have explosive devices planted around your place of work, and then for somebody to expect you to go back to work. It's not normal, nor is it acceptable. Only in a system of white supremacist delusion is that acceptable. These are the things that we have to start questioning, y'all. We have got to start questioning what they show us and tell us is normal. This is the reason I said do not go back to normal, because that shit, they wanted to call that like valiant. That's not just normal, that's exceptional to them. And what I tell you is that is violence on violence. That is what it is that we who are working towards any kind of healing and liberation in the world, if you've worked with any kind of survivors, we tell people all the time, like, it is not okay for somebody to then just expect you to return to normal like trauma hasn't happened to you. We know that trauma-informed care tells us that that's not acceptable. And it's deeply unhealthy and part of perpetuating systems of violence. But we just watched it on a governmental level and treated it like it wasn't a big deal. Treated it like it was something to applaud. It was not applause-worthy. What would have been applause-worthy is somebody to say, we experienced something incredibly violent and terrifying. And right now, what I would like to extend to everyone in this chamber is to go home and do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, to heal, to begin a healing process, to be with your loved ones. These votes are still here in this box, and we will tend to this tomorrow. But today, we will tend to our own wellness so that we can show up to this job from a place of wellness and not a place of trauma and activated adrenal systems. Nobody's making good decisions. We know nobody's making good decisions in that state, and yet we just let them. This is how America runs. It's not sustainable. And it's not just how it runs on a governmental level. It's how it's taught us to run. Where is that system operating in you? That was not valiant what those Congress people did. It was foolish. It was harmful. It was a perpetuation of trauma and violence. And we need to stop normalizing that shit. It's sick. It is not normal. It's not valiant. It's not heroic. It's part of the sickness that is white supremacist delusion. That is America.